Okay, this will be a basic instructional video on how to subnet. When I was watching some videos on YouTube, I noticed that most of them were confusing or they didn't fully explain how they came to the end result. So I decided to create my own video to explain how I subnet. Okay, starting off. First thing you want to look at is the IP address. For this project, it's going to be 192.168.50.0. We want to see 25 hosts, and we want to use the third usable address scheme. Really quick before we go any further, if you take a look at the chart at the top, you have the network segment and your host segment. The network segment is your network. That will be what your IPs will be based off of. The host segment is the number of hosts inside of your IP scheme. If you take a look at the subnet, 255.255.255.0, right now, at the very beginning, that is /24. That's 24 bits on and the other 8 off. So, to start off, what you want to do is you want to see your hosts. You need to have 25 hosts. Well, what you'll do is you go to your host count on the upper right side, and you'll notice that it's 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256. Well, you need 25 hosts, so you just pick the one that 25 can go into, and that's where your host segment stops at. So you notice 25 can't go into 2, 4, 8, or 16, but it can go into 32, so that's where you set your host at. So that means the last 5 bits in the last octet will be your host segment, which means the first 3 bits in that last octet will now be part of the network segment. Finding out the subnet mask now is pretty simple. What you want to do is you want to take the first 3 bits in the last octet that are now network segment and add those 3 bits, which is 128, 64, and 32. And when you do that, you'll get 224. So now your subnet is 255.255.255.224. This also means that you are no longer using a /24. You're using a /27. Because 255.255.255 is a /24 because it's 24 bits. When you add the extra 3 bits, you get 27 bits, which means it turns into a /27. So if you ever wonder when someone says /24 or /27, this is what it's representing. It's representing the bit count for the subnet mask. So now that we have our network segment and our host segment figured out, we now move down to the part where it says use the third usable address scheme. So let's take a look at our table. The first line, 0-not used. This is not used most of the time in Cisco related material, yet the IP scheme does work if you use it on a router or in your home network or anything. So let's start off. 192.168.50.0. That's your beginning address for your first IP scheme. First usable in that list is 192.168.50.1. If you were to fill up your entire host segment with ones, so that's 11111 in the last 5, that'd be 16 plus 8 plus 4 plus 2 plus 1. That comes out to 31. That's why the broadcast address for this IP scheme is 50.31 for the first line. You will now have your first IP, which is your network IP address, which is 192.168.50.0, which cannot be used on a host such as a router, a computer, or a server. And then you have your last IP, which is 192.168.50.31, which is the broadcast address for that IP scheme. And what you'll do is you can build from there what your first usable and your last usable is by just knowing those 2 IP addresses. Also, it lets you know what your next usable IP scheme is. So let's move down to line 2, 1-1 or 1-first usable, 192.168.50.32. That is the next IP in the list. So that moves you down to your second network first usable. The first usable IP address in that one is 192.168.50.33. Now, you know that it was 31 host segments maximum per IP, per usable address scheme. So, now that you know that 32 is your network, you can take 32 and add 31 and you end with 63, which now shows you that your broadcast address for your first usable will now be 50.63. So now you automatically know your last usable IP address on that scheme is going to be 62. And you also know that your next usable network is going to be 64. And see, once you find the pattern in the list of networks, like if you look on the list, you'll see 0, 32, 64, 96, 128. Once you have that scheme, you can build your IP scheme much faster and figure out what your next network is going to be. This makes it really easy when the host segment has been reduced to, let's say, 2 or 4 hosts per scheme. Because in those lists you can get to 15, the 15th usable subnet. And, once you figure the pattern out, it goes much quicker. Now that we have everything down to the second one, we can automatically build our third list, which is our third usable IP address, and you can find that it's 192.168.50.96. That is the usable scheme, the one that we've been looking for, 192.168.50.96, with 50.97 being your first usable, 50.126 being your last usable, and 50.127 being your broadcast address for that subnet. If you really study the network segment, the host count, the bit value, the subnet, and how to calculate the subnet mask, I really think if you tried it a couple times on a piece of paper, you'd probably be able to figure out your subnets really quickly. It does take a bit more pencil and paperwork than normal, but not really. You can actually drop it down from what I've showed here. You don't need to show your first usable, your last usable. If you can figure out your network and your broadcast it, you can fly through your subnetting really quickly. Thanks for watching, guys.